and broadly shared economic growth. And thank you to our witnesses here today who are leading experts in the growing movement for widespread electrification. The fact is that if we ever want to address our contributions to our climate problem, we need to find sustainable and cost-effective substitutes for all of the devices and machines that we use today that combust fossil fuels. And it's not just our gas-powered cars and trucks. We're also burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon pollution from our hot water heaters, our furnaces, our clothes dryers, our ovens and stoves. In addition to the climate impacts, researchers are finding that burning fossil fuels in our homes, including methane or natural gas as it's commonly called, is really bad for our health. This is particularly the case if someone in your family has asthma or other respiratory conditions. Even if you are properly ventilating your fossil combustion devices, the particulate matter in the exhaust from your gas-range stove likely includes unhealthy levels of harmful chemicals like nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and even formaldehyde. But the good news is that there are already better electric alternatives for each of these fossil-burning machines in our homes. Each of these electric substitutes can help reduce our climate pollution and create savings on our energy bills. Just last month, I invited Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm to visit New Mexico. During her visit, we met with homeowners in Albuquerque's International District neighborhood who are participating in an exciting demonstration project that is helping families install energy-efficient and electric water heaters and air source heat pumps in their homes. Tammy Feeblecorn from the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project told us that installing these new appliances is reducing the burden of energy costs for these low-income families. As she put it, the project is, quote, fighting climate change while also making sure that the benefits of that fight make it to our front line and our disadvantaged communities. That's exactly right. These new electric appliances will be much more efficient than the fossil-fueled machines that they are replacing. And that can mean significant savings for these families on their monthly utility bills. Those savings can make an enormous difference for a family that's living paycheck to paycheck. And importantly for our climate, all of these electrified machines can be powered by all the new clean and carbon pollution-free electricity that we will generate in our new clean energy economy. This is how we can power our long-term economic recovery and save families money by solving our pressing climate challenge. This is how we build back better. We need to get to a place where each time a family sits around the kitchen table to figure out how to replace a broken furnace or stove or water heater, they choose to and can afford to install an electric machine. That's exactly why I introduced the Zero Emission Homes Act to establish a point-of-sale rebates program for these new electric appliances. Through this type of federal investment, we can make all of the long-term economic and health benefits of electrification affordable and accessible to all Americans. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make transformative investments in our energy economy, investments that will protect our planet, help keep our communities healthy, and promote shared prosperity. We simply don't have any more time to waste in meeting our responsibility on climate. Widespread electrification is one of the surest strategies we can pursue to finally take actions that meet the scale of this challenge. I'd like to now turn things over to Ranking Member Lee for his opening comments.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Our country needs to modernize the way we generate, transmit, and distribute electricity. Over the last year, devastating blackouts have harmed communities across the country, from New York to California to Texas. The U.S. electric grid has at times proven inadequate for the needs of American families. However, the answer is not to spend billions of federal taxpayer dollars to electrify every American home and business, and just as importantly, the answer is not to fundamentally alter the federal policy to regulate energy in its generation and in its consumption. Instead, we need to unshackle American industry so that new and diverse energy sources can help create a more resilient energy future for America. It was not that long ago that American innovation unleashed the Shale Revolution, driving down natural gas prices and providing a cleaner energy option for homes and businesses. We need a similar revolution if we want to modernize our electric grid. To clear a path for continued energy innovation, we must reform existing regulatory policies that stand in the way of investors and discourage entrepreneurs. If we want to move our energy infrastructure into the future, we need to address environmental review. When President Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, into law, it was meant to require agencies to consider the environmental consequences of their actions. NEPA is generally implicated when projects use federal funds or when they touch federal lands, which many energy projects do. Now, 50 years later, this seemingly common-sense requirement has transformed into a process that requires an average of 4.5 years and sometimes 2 decades or even more of paperwork and litigation. The NEPA process frequently discourages and prevents critical energy infrastructure projects from being built. The delays might be worth it if NEPA protected the environment, but environmental review is strictly procedural, meaning that it doesn't actually privilege environmental protection. This means that paperwork and lawyers' fees are the most consistent result of the NEPA process. Federal agencies can find that the action under consideration imposes environmental harm and then theoretically decide to approve the agency anyway, notwithstanding those problems. The process even delays projects with clear environmental benefits. Without reform, NEPA leaves countless energy infrastructure projects in a state of bureaucratic limbo, sidelining workers, stunting innovative new technologies, and leaving communities across the country to wait for Washington to approve their future. That's unacceptable, and it's why I've introduced the Unshackle Act. This suite of bills reforms the NEPA process so that federal agencies are better empowered to carry out the law's original intent, while also making our nation's infrastructure projects affordable again. The Unshackle Act would require agencies to finish their environmental assessments faster, allow them to reuse paperwork that they've already generated, and limit duplicative work at state and federal levels. It would apply a 2-year deadline for the completion of the entire NEPA process, provide fair legal parameters around project reviews, and allow states to handle NEPA review within their own borders. Now, these reforms shouldn't be partisan in nature. They're designed to achieve something that we can all agree on. That is more efficient, effective federal permitting for environmental projects. Ultimately, the best energy future is one that allows the American people to innovate. Americans have made great strides pursuing breakthroughs in energy extraction, production, and technological innovations in wind, solar, hydroelectric, and other renewable forms of energy in the face of heavy-handed government control. Removing existing regulatory burdens will allow Americans to build a more sustainable future. The ability to build and build more quickly will help make the U.S. electric grid more robust, resilient, and reduce the frequency of outages. It'll become cleaner, more affordable, and more reliable power to American families and communities will be provided. As we rebuild after the pandemic, we must liberate our energy sector. We must reduce regulatory barriers to developing nuclear, hydro, geothermal, and other forms of energy. These technologies can be an important part of a competitive energy sector and a diverse energy future. So let's get government out of the way and allow Americans to do what they do best. Reforming policies that get in the way of modernizing our energy infrastructure will boost economic prospects for American families, improve the environment, and enable us to build a better America. I'm hopeful that today's hearing will convince us of the urgent need to achieve that very goal. Thank you.
We have 4 witnesses here to share their expertise today. Our first witness will be Mr. Matusiak, the CEO of Rewiring America, a nonprofit that aims to electrify everything, starting with the 121 million U.S. households that make the decisions accounting for 42% of U.S. energy-related carbon emissions. Rewiring America's mission is to revitalize the U.S. economy and tackle the climate crisis through a detailed policy agenda, including low-cost financing and targeted regulatory and code interventions to cut the costs of energy-efficient measures like solar panels and electrify each American home. Mr. Matusiak is also a co-founder and managing partner of Purpose Venture Group, a social impact advisory firm and incubator that builds community-centered ventures focused on combating climate and economic inequality. He served in the Obama White House as a special assistant to the president and director of private sector engagement, where his focus was on economic policy related to jobs and competitiveness. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from Brown University and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. Our second witness will be Dr. Leah Stokes. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and is affiliated with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and the Environmental Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research areas include energy, climate, and environment politics with a particular focus on renewable energy. Her academic work has been published in some of the top publications in her field, including Nature Energy, Energy Policy, and the American Political Science Review. In 2020, Dr. Stokes published a book entitled Short-Circuiting Policy, which examines clean energy policies to understand why states are not on track to address the climate crisis and how fossil fuel companies and electricity providers have put profit above progress by promoting climate denial and delay. Dr. Stokes has a PhD in public policy from MIT and master's degrees from MIT's Political Science Department and the School of International and Public Affairs and the Earth Institute at Columbia University. She has a bachelor degree in psychology and East Asian studies from the University of Toronto. Our third witness will be Mr. Danielle Baird, a green entrepreneur who is the CEO of Block Power, which he launched as a startup in 2012. Block Power markets, finances, and installs solar and energy-efficient technology in homes and buildings across 15 U.S. cities, where it trains and hires local vulnerable populations for jobs, including installing smart, low-cost sensors and thermostats and retrofitting large heating and cooling systems. Mr. Baird aims to replace heating and cooling systems that run on fossil fuels with greener and more energy-efficient alternatives such as electric heat pumps and solar panels. Block Power has completed energy projects in over 1,000 buildings in the New York area, helping clients from small businesses to nonprofits save 20 to 40% on their energy bills each year. Block Power has secured investments and partnerships with Fortune 500 companies like Goldman Sachs and Apple, and Mr. Baird was selected as a 2020 Dial Fellow by the Emerson Collective. Mr. Baird obtained his BA from Duke University and his MBA from Columbia Business School in 2013. Our fourth witness will be Dr. Eli Dorado. Dr. Dorado is a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. His area of focus are on the new technology and innovation needed to drive large increases in economic growth, including the expedition of infrastructure deployment and the elimination of barriers for entrepreneurs. Dr. Dorado has worked on a wide range of technology policy issues, including aviation, internet governance, and cryptocurrency. Dr. Dorado previously worked as a senior researcher at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and as director of its technology policy program. Dr. Dorado served as an advisor to the State Department on international telecommunications matters and as an economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis. He has a BA in economics and political science from Furman University and a PhD in economics from George Mason University. The committee will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide remarks. Mr. Matusiak, let's begin with your testimony, and then we'll continue in the order of introductions. Mr. Matusiak, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Heinrich, thank you. Ranking Member Lee, other distinguished members of the committee, thank you for having me and for shining a spotlight on household and building electrification, the most central path for Americans to take to cut climate-changing emissions in half by 2030 and to zero them out before 2050. I am CEO of the nonprofit Rewiring America, founded just over 1 year ago. Our co-founder, Saul Griffith, was hired by the U.S. government to map the energy sector down to 1.1% fidelity on both the supply and the demand side. The upshot? The roughly 100 quads of energy we generate and consume as a country each year produce about 90% of our emissions. When it comes to reducing emissions, much attention has been paid to the supply side as we work to decarbonize our energy supply. The conversation on the demand side has been largely focused on replacing combustion engine vehicles with electric ones. But the residential housing sector is another and very large part of the demand side. If we are cleaning our grid, we must also clean all of the machines that use it. We cannot get to zero emissions by any date unless we do. And that means that building decarbonization is the great unmet need in our climate policy. Indeed, at Rewiring America, we calculate that over 40% of energy-related emissions in the U.S. exist as a result of decisions made around the kitchen table. What we drive, how we heat and cool our homes, how we heat our water, how we cook our food, how we dry our clothes. There are 121 million households in America. In order to get to zero emissions by 2050, we calculate America must replace or install 1 billion machines across all of those households in that time frame. The time frame is important because these machines last for a long time, 10 to 25 years on average. Put it this way. Every time an opportunity is missed to install an efficient electric machine, we put further pressure on hitting our 2050 target. Every machine counts. For us, that is an affirming and optimistic prognosis, because if those 1 billion machines represent around 40% of our emissions as a country, 65% if you include small businesses, then we can develop a plan for addressing them, one efficient electric machine at a time. We don't need to wait on any moonshot technology. It all already exists. We don't need to ask Americans to sacrifice or change their lifestyles to survive. We can define our climate strategy in a way that benefits every American directly and immediately. Those 1 billion machines also represent an enormous economic opportunity for America, because if we need all these efficient electric machines, so too does the rest of the world. According to our modeling, replacing carbon-dependent appliances increases household discretionary income, creates local jobs that cannot be automated or offshored, and reduces the health costs of burning fossil fuels in our homes. That's a triple win, on top of the fourth win of helping emissions. Here are the numbers. At least 85% of households in the U.S., 103 million, could save $37.3 billion a year on energy bills if they were using modern electrified furnaces or water heaters instead of their current machines. Of the households in the U.S. that would save by electrifying, 44% of them are low to moderate income. Each year, they could save an average of $377, and we estimate that by 2030, that number could go up to $2,500. Outside of these direct pocketbook benefits to Americans, and especially low and moderate income Americans, electrification would create 462,000 installation jobs in the U.S. that can't be automated or offshored. In addition, it would further generate another 80,000 manufacturing jobs and 800,000 indirect and induced jobs. And on the healthcare front, which has boomeranging effects into our economy, electrifying household appliances would address the 42% increased risk of children experiencing asthma symptoms associated with gas stoves, and the 15,500 premature deaths in the U.S. that come from outdoor air pollution from buildings. Those are a lot of numbers. The point is this. If the upfront costs were the same, we think Americans would choose to electrify their households every single time an appliance fails and needs to be replaced. In not installing these machines, these households will be locking in emissions for 1 to 2 decades or more because of the brand new carbon-dependent machines that would be installed instead. This is a machine-by-machine plan that puts us on a path to zero emissions. It's an optimistic plan that carries with it a moral and economic imperative for action, because not only is it the right answer for our planet, it also does right by Americans and their families today. By the numbers, there is simply no greater opportunity for the Congress to unlock another American century of economic expansion and prosperity than by investing in the electrification of our economy, starting with the American household. It is time to understand our households as the keystone of our climate infrastructure. We encourage you to use your vested powers to make real the opportunity before us and to continue to use your bully pulpit to educate Americans about the role we can all play in realizing our shared future and potential. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman, and to all the members of the committee.
Dr. Stokes.
Vice Chairman Heinrich, Ranking Member Lee, and distinguished members of the Joint Economic Committee, good afternoon. For more than 3 decades, scientists like me have come before Congress to warn lawmakers like you that climate change poses a dire risk to our economy. Those warnings have now come to pass. Last year, the United States experienced 22 separate billion-dollar climate and weather disasters, which cost us nearly $500 billion. That is the economic cost of inaction on climate change, and it is growing every year. You already know the broad contours of what I am going to say. Congress must act now to cut carbon pollution by reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Americans have asked you to do this for years through phone calls, letters, and testimony. I am urging you to listen, not just to me and to other scientists, but to the American people, and act now on the climate crisis. We must cut carbon pollution by 45% by 2030 to have a chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. President Biden has a plan to do that, but we need Congress to act on that plan and pass his Build Back Better agenda. This includes investing in building electrification. Our homes are our safe places, yet scientists are uncovering that burning fossil gas in buildings is dangerous to our health. Children living in a home with a gas stove have a 42% increased chance of having asthma. Even when a gas stove or other gas appliance is turned off, it is still leaking, and that gas contains carcinogens like benzene, which cause cancer. Thankfully, we've got the solutions to remove pollution from our homes. We can use electric technologies like induction stoves and heat pumps. Clean electricity combined with electrification could cut 3/4 of our carbon pollution. To accelerate building electrification, Congress must make key investments now. The goal should be to have clean appliances be the default choice for all Americans. Zero-emission appliance rebates are crucial for making clean technologies accessible to all Americans. These investments will catalyze a market, creating lower costs through innovation. They will also help to avoid locking in carbon pollution, as appliances installed today may still be operating in the 2040s. This is also smart economic policy because it will avoid creating stranded costs. Additional dollars should also flow to the Weatherization Assistance Program, to tax credits, and to grants for domestic manufacturing of clean appliances. Congress should also invest in clean electricity through both tax credits for power producers and grants for utilities that increase their share of clean power. Cleaner electricity will help building electrification deliver even greater benefits. All of these investments will be multiplied many times over by growing the economy, and they'll pay themselves back. Through aggressive federal government investments in building electrification, we could create 1 million jobs this decade. And many of these jobs cannot be taken overseas. If you want to have a heat pump in your home, you actually have to have an American worker install that in your home. These federal investments are also crucial to reducing inequality and healthcare costs. Clean buildings are important for all of us, but they're particularly important for people of color who are exposed to higher levels of indoor air pollution. Federal investments can also cut energy bills. With Congress's help, more than 100 million American households could save money by installing these modern electric appliances. So cleaning up the American economy is a win-win. It creates jobs, it saves Americans money, it advances equality, and it keeps the United States competitive globally. So the climate solutions are ready. The question is speed. To deploy these clean technologies fast enough, we need Congress's help. You can act now to catalyze the market, creating millions of jobs and saving everyday Americans money. I'd like to close by sharing something personal. I have 2 newborn babies that are 2 months old at home right now, and I have left them to come here and speak with all of you because I know the urgency of this moment. I'm here not just to speak on behalf of my newborn children, but on behalf of all the children in the United States. I'm also here to speak on behalf of young people who are deeply fearful about what their future holds. And quite frankly, I'm here to speak on behalf of all of us because we are already seeing what climate change is doing to the places and the people we cherish most. This is a pivotal moment in history. The world is watching. Either Congress will pass a bold climate investment package this fall, or we will lose the last best opportunity we have and wait another decade. We don't have any more decades left to waste to act on the climate crisis. Thank you.
Mr. Baird.
Good afternoon. Is this on? Great. Greetings to all the members of this distinguished committee. My name is Danielle Baird. I grew up in a Brooklyn apartment building that did not have a working heating system. Like many of our neighbors in Brooklyn, mostly immigrant families, we heated our apartment with a gas oven, and so every night we would turn on the gas burner, open up the oven door, and that was kind of how we heat everything. My dad was a mechanical engineer, so we knew that the oven produced carbon monoxide and other toxins and was not safe, so we opened up all the windows every night to clear the air. You don't need to be an engineer or the CEO of a clean tech startup to know that releasing toxic gases into your family's bedrooms is bad for public health, and that leaving windows open to mitigate the impact is a waste of resources. I founded my climate tech startup, Block Power, to help address the energy issues my family struggled with while growing up. Households account for 42% of U.S. carbon emissions, and Block Power is focused on greening buildings, replacing old, antiquated fossil fuel energy systems with all-electric technology. Our business case is simple. We install clean, zero-emission technology in older buildings that waste fossil fuels all over the country. We make money because the technology saves so much money to the building owner that we are able to make investments and amortize other health measures into transactions with that saves so much money that we can finance all of this. We are able to turn a profit and leave households spending less on energy than they were before by utilizing these technologies. In the process, we dramatically lower buildings' carbon emissions. We make them healthier and more comfortable. In essence, we're creating both jobs and healthier buildings and healthier communities while delivering financial and economic impact. We've completed upgrades in over 1,200 buildings, apartment buildings, schools, houses of worship, townhomes, single-family buildings in New York City's poorest neighborhoods, impacting tens of thousands of families. And we've built software to analyze the impact of these technologies on over 120 million buildings across America. I'll never forget one of our first projects in the Bronx when we were called in to convert an aging school building following a tragedy. The building had been burning fossil fuels in its basement to power the facility. However, the building's ventilation system was set up improperly. As a result, air pollution from the fossil fuel system in the basement was being pumped into the cafeteria every single day, contributing to chronic asthma amongst all the school children. The school nurse had 70 different Ziploc bags with pieces of tape with all of the 4-year-olds' names on it to figure out which inhaler went to which child. The air was so poor that one day a 4-year-old had an asthma attack, needed to go to the emergency room, and later died. We know this is not an isolated incident. Our schools and our homes across this country need and deserve electrification. Electric buildings are better buildings. The problems of dirty fuels in buildings are fixable. We know electric building technology works. In Brooklyn, new buildings under construction often include heat pumps. We have installed systems in hundreds of buildings throughout New York City and now coast to coast. We have the ability to bring the same incredible electric heating technology, both the software and the hardware, to the challenges of heating and cooling in buildings. These are real benefits to families, and aggregated across America, these benefits to our economy are massive. But I want to point out that the markets have spoken, the private sector has spoken, and endorsed better building electrification technology. All electric, carbon, low carbon, healthy buildings are being embraced by Apple, Microsoft, Google, Goldman Sachs, the American Family Life Insurance Company, Salesforce, the New York State government, and energy giant Exelon. And I know this because we partner with all of them and they've invested in our company to electrify America's building stock. The government has a key role to play to ensure that the benefits of all electric buildings are accessible to all Americans. Rebates will help to reduce the upfront cost. Today, we raise 5 private dollars for every single government dollar that is invested. In addition, expanding lending authority through the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office could provide significant new capital to grow electrification across the U.S. We can make our houses smart, an all-electric and responsive to a modern cyber-secure smart grid so that we can protect ourselves from climate disasters. America can and should lead the world in innovation, manufacturing, and the workforce to convert our real estate stock. Thank you.
Dr. Dorado.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Heinrich, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Eli Dorado, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. I study the technologies that could bring about transformative economic growth and the obstacles they face. Climate change is a technology problem. New technologies are our only realistic hope to significantly reduce carbon emissions. The way to address climate change is not to deindustrialize society and go back to a less prosperous past. It is to charge boldly into the future. On that, I believe we all strongly agree. There's a slogan that represents one vision of this future: electrify everything. Like all slogans, it oversimplifies. I'd like to use this opportunity to raise some nuance and offer some additional solutions that will make us more likely to achieve our decarbonization goals. First, we must be realistic about the necessary electrical system upgrades. Electrifying heating makes financial sense for many, but not all individual homeowners. But even if heat pumps make individual economic sense, they may not make collective economic sense until upgrades are available for our electrical grid and generation capacity. Mass adoption of electric heat pumps, particularly in the coldest parts of the country where they are least efficient, will flip the time of peak electricity demand from summer to winter. Since our current system is only built to the capacity of the summer peak, without new capacity, the coldest winter days would be met with rolling blackouts at exactly the time we most need reliable energy. Heating is a safety-critical service. People die if the heating goes out. If we want to rely exclusively on electricity for heating, we must invest not only in additional capacity to meet peak demand, but also in grid hardening, like placing wires underground where they can't be downed by falling trees. Which brings me to my next point. We must make it easier to build. If we're going to do so much building, new peak load power plants, undergrounding of wires, new long-distance transmission lines, and new wind and solar farms, it is worth first addressing the excessive cost of building new infrastructure in this country. Among the chief culprits are laws that give project opponents a way to slow or stop the permitting and siting process. Laws intended to support environmental justice, like the National Environmental Policy Act, have instead been weaponized by NIMBYs or competitors to slow progress. Research from the Brookings Institution found that interstate highway construction costs tripled between the 1960s and the 1980s. The researchers dated the inflection point to the early 1970s, which they noted was precisely when NEPA took effect. By lengthening and adding risk to the permitting process, NEPA makes financing large capital-intensive projects less attractive. Some have proposed new federal subsidies for long-distance transmission projects to overcome this obstacle. While subsidies for these projects may be desirable in isolation, it is unwise to spend taxpayer money to overcome a permitting obstacle that Congress created and has the tools to fix. Congress should first remove the permitting obstacles and then consider whether new subsidies are still necessary. Even if they are still necessary, they would return much higher value for the taxpayer with the permitting obstacles removed. The country would also greatly benefit from new zero-carbon baseload power plants, either nuclear or geothermal. To accommodate all of this building, we need thoroughgoing permitting reform of the kind that has been proposed in the Unshackle Act. Third, we should avoid picking winners and losers. A downside of a strong policy focus on electric heat pumps or anything else is that it puts politicians in the role of picking the winning technology. If left to compete on a level playing field, a range of other possible solutions, including non-electric options, could help to decarbonize heating. Some possibilities include district heating and high-quality offsets from genuine carbon removal projects. Instead of selecting one technology to decarbonize heating on its own, Congress should achieve its goals with technology-neutral policies. Finally, the committee should recognize that the economic benefits of addressing climate change will not come from jobs, but from cheap and abundant clean energy. Consider electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have many advantages over combustion vehicles, but one of them is that they have fewer moving parts and therefore require less maintenance expense. This reduction in maintenance requirements will translate to thousands of mechanic jobs being destroyed. Should we oppose electric vehicles on this score? Of course not. The economic opportunity from addressing climate change comes from rethinking energy, not from creating jobs. if we could repeat the stunning cost reductions we have observed in wind and solar energy in firm, dense technologies like advanced nuclear and advanced geothermal, we could double or triple per capita primary energy use. That would truly make the economy boom. I once again thank the committee for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me now recognize the Vice Chair from the state of Utah, Senator Lee, for his questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Dorado, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. And I appreciated your testimony and your insights that were very helpful. Now, you've written a little bit about the promise of geothermal energy based on the fact that it's clean, it's cheap, and it's an abundant energy source, but suggested that in many ways, poor policy on the books now could be standing in the way of our capitalizing on that and benefiting from geothermal energy. The most favorable conditions for geothermal power happen to be found in the western United States, where coincidentally the federal government happens to control a very significant portion of all the land. Now, can you tell us specifically how federal policy could help make geothermal electricity generation more competitive and thus more of a reality?
Yes, Senator, thank you for the question. As you noted, the most near-term resources for geothermal are all in the West and overlap significantly with federal lands. And geothermal has a very strong learning by doing component. Bringing technology porting it over from the oil and gas sector, people leaving the oil and gas sector and starting the new advanced geothermal sector. They need experience and practice, and that process of delivering power is what's going to drive the cost down and make it available eventually everywhere in the country, not just where the easy resources are located. On federal lands, to get a permit to drill, whether it's an oil and gas well or a geothermal well, you need permission from the Bureau of Land Management. And because the oil and gas industry has so much influence in Washington, they were able to get a categorical exclusion from NEPA review. So they only have to do a 2-week approval process to get their wells approved. Whereas in geothermal wells, it takes about 2 years to get an approval from the Bureau of Land Management. So I think a very promising policy would be to extend the exclusion that currently exists. It's under the exact same conditions that exist for oil and gas, and make them available for geothermal as well. And that would, I think, radically increase access to progress in geothermal energy in the coming years within this decade.
So let me get this straight. We've given more favorable NEPA regulatory treatment to oil and gas drilling on federal lands than we have to geothermal drilling on federal lands.
That's exactly correct, Senator.
Geothermal sources are effectively renewable. I mean, they're not emitting things. They're not emitting carbon into the atmosphere. They're not polluting the atmosphere. The same cannot be said of oil and gas drilling. Is that correct? And so why would that make any sense? What plausible, defensible public policy justification could there be for treating oil and gas drilling more favorably than we treat geothermal drilling?
I don't think there's any good reason for it, Senator. Geothermal is a renewable technology, but it's also a vast existing reservoir. So actually the amount of geothermal energy that exists is 40 times greater than all fossil fuel energy and all fissionable material combined. So it's just a massive resource. It would power our economy for the next billion years, and it makes no sense that it favors. There's a disfavored relative to oil and gas.
Thank you. That's very informative. Dr. Stokes, I want to talk to you for a moment. I take it you've been involved in the development of the Clean Energy, Clean Electricity Performance Program. And as you know, the CEPP would require significant renewable solar development. One study produced by Princeton University suggests that land equivalent to the size of the of the state of West Virginia could be necessary for solar deployment in a full zero emissions transmission. Do you know about how many acres of federal land you'd anticipate would be needed to realize the development of CEPP?
Well, I would say that actually clean energy sources would be eligible under that program, not just solar. And of course, solar can also be put on rooftops and other buildings, so it doesn't necessarily require a lot of land to do it.
Sure. There are other sources that could be included within it.
That are included, yes.
And one of those is wind. Now, the same Princeton University study suggests that an area equivalent to the acreage of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas may be needed for wind turbines to reach zero emissions, all of those states combined. So how many acres of federal land do you think would be needed?
Well, you don't have to develop renewables on federal land. It's of course an option, and I think there may be some, good reasons for doing it in some places. You can also do it offshore. In the case of offshore wind, you can do geothermal, as Dr. Dorado's been talking about. You can do carbon capture and sequestration, nuclear energy. The Clean Electricity Performance Program is a technology-neutral approach, so it does not require the building of renewables on federal lands.
By the way, one of the biggest emitters, as I understand, one of the dirtier sources of pollution happens to be heating oil. Would you agree with that?
Heating oil, yes. Mhm.
Are there efforts underway to ban that? Is that part of your initiative?
I'm not trying to ban anything, and I don't really have an initiative, so to speak. I know there are efforts in New York City, for example, to try to clean up heating oil in that city, as that's been used for many decades in New York City. So heating oil does have significant health impacts at the building level, as well as carbon pollution impacts as well.
Okay. I see my time's expired. Thank you.
Mr. Senator Lee, thank you very much. Let me begin with just the formal chairman's statement, which is just, I'm so pleased that you're here this afternoon. And I really want to thank my friend and colleague, Vice Chairman Heinrich, for bringing us together for this important discussion. Climate change is a threat not only to our planet, but also to our health of our economy. So we need to look at the multitude of solutions, including electrification technologies. So in the interest of time, I just want to submit my opening statement for the record and move right to some questions. Mr. Matusiak, I was fascinated by all of your statistics, the $37.3 billion a year savings, the 462,000 installation jobs created, the 15,000 premature deaths not happening. You didn't do the other side of it, which are the jobs that go away in the gas industry or the coal mine or something like that. Do you have any sense, when you net it out, what the impact on economic growth would be from electrifying our economy?
Thank you, Chair.
What the increment to GDP growth might be?
Well, thank you, Chairman. It's wonderful being with you today and for the opportunity. By our analysis, there are, over the course of the next 20 years, 25 years, an opportunity to create 25 million jobs in the electrification of the economy, 5 million durable, sustainable jobs over that time frame. And when you look at the transition of jobs across different sectors, there is a significant opportunity to retrain and to put people to work doing things that they are accustomed to doing. So, for example, if we're talking about installing water heaters and furnaces, if they are electric, they are heat pumps, that is part of a transition of opportunity, of economic opportunity. But the upshot here is that the electrification of the economy unlocks a massive opportunity. It is a massive opportunity in job creation. It's a massive opportunity in localized job creation. And it's a massive opportunity in economic catalyst in terms of, as an economic catalyst in terms of the money that flows through the economy when you start to stack the incremental jobs that are created, the incremental savings that households realize, the lower costs to communities when it comes to healthcare costs and all the rest. We have an opportunity to put a lot more money to work in the economy, which creates a lot more jobs, as you well know. And so for us, the electrification strategy is not just a climate imperative, a moral imperative, frankly, the path by which we get to zero emissions. It is the win-win-win strategy whereby we create the jobs that power us into the next century of economic prosperity as a country and allow us to maintain our economic position as not just a leader in terms of our standard for the world, but in terms of the machines that we are producing, making, and exporting to the other countries that will certainly need them as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Stokes, you sort of made the public health case for the electrification of buildings, with the 42% of kids in gas-heated homes cooking. Can you expand on that? Is this something that OSHA should be doing or national building permit standards?
Well, there are actually discussions that gas appliances should come with warnings for citizens and for Americans that they pose health and safety risks. Sort of consumer reports could, for example, put a sticker on these appliances warning people that, they can increase the risk of asthma, that they can be involved in emitting carcinogens into your home, that there are significant health risks to these appliances. And it's interesting because we've lived with them in our homes for a long time. We've sort of celebrated them as this wonderful innovation. But what scientists are uncovering right now with research that's ongoing is that there's a really big health side effect to burning gas in our homes. And so I think that the American people, as they learn more and more about the science, are going to realize that they haven't fully understood the health implications of having this in their homes, and that it's possible that the American government could be doing more to help inform Americans about the risks of having gas in their homes.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Dorado, you talked about the misuse of NEPA, NIMBY, people weaponizing it and the like, and the rise of the citizen voice. Is there something wrong with having a citizen voice in this process, especially when we look back at all the times when citizens had no voice? And
Senator, Mr. Chairman, I believe democracy is very important. And I think it's most important at election time. And I think in many other decisions, I think it's better if we let the wheels of government turn without involving every member of the community that might have an objection to a given project. We need to let projects go forward if we want to build in this country.
All right. Thank you very much for that perspective. My time is up. Let me now recognize my friend from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple things here. So where do you start? And it was interesting. Senator Lee actually asked one of the things that's always, and look, I'm a Westerner. I've actually never seen a fuel oil heating, but I've seen the data on it, and it's absolutely unhealthy. It's filthy. And I'm almost surprised that the reaction wasn't absolutely, if natural gas appliance needs labeling this and that, the others need to be pulled out immediately. So, just a little surprised at is it Diho? What's the best way to pronounce it? Doctor from Utah.
Dorado.
Dorado. I'm sorry. I learned to actually wear glasses. I actually want to walk through one of my personal fixations, and I care a lot about this because being from the desert Southwest, we have the largest nuclear power plant in the country, but we also have tremendous photovoltaic and actually some decent hydro. Are you familiar with the SunZia power line? In the middle of in the middle of New Mexico is one of the greatest wind assets in the United States. And California functionally contracted, the LA County contracted for this wonderful wind-generated asset. We're approaching 20 years to move the power line, to get it permitted, because it crosses a number of jurisdictions. Oddly enough, the real problem have been the government jurisdictions. So in some ways, it becomes actually a fraudulent narrative here when we say we want to exploit our wind assets, and then without the same breath, my friends, and I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, don't also articulate saying we need major NEPA reforms to actually move the power generated from those wind assets and help me understand, because this is one, it crosses through Arizona, hits the Palo Verde hub, as you probably know if you specialize in electricity, and then would move to the LA basin. But seriously, you talk to the investors on this, and today they say, we wouldn't do this again. You know, something that was going to take 6, 7 years now is approaching 20 years. How common do you run into this? What would you do in NEPA reform?
I talk to a lot of companies, including hard tech startups that run into NEPA issues all the time. It is ubiquitous throughout the economy that at various times you need federal government approval for something, and that brings in NEPA reform, some sort of NEPA review. A lot of times it isn't an environmental impact statement. I think the federal government only finalizes about 200 environmental impact statements a year, but they do about 12,000 environmental assessments per year. And each of these is hundreds of pages long, sometimes thousands of pages of appendices, takes multiple years, and it just adds a tremendous, entirely procedural burden on a lot of projects. So I think it's a very significant obstacle to building in this country.
Yeah, and I wasn't going to burden everyone. We have a whole binder of little charts of photovoltaic projects, actually even some power coming out of earth energy, and you can't move the lines. One other one, just have you seen the charts that talk about over the next few years, carbon emissions, particularly greenhouse emissions in the United States, are going to go up? And a lot of it's because we're about to remove much of our baseload nuclear off the grid, and by removing that baseload nuclear, our generation base is truly impaired. What is your understanding on that data set?
I think that's generally correct, and it's as an example, New York City just closed down one of its nuclear facilities, saying it would be replaced with renewable energy, and it was replaced with fossil fuels. So it was fossil fuels that made up the load that was missing from the shut down nuclear plant. So I think it's important to not only keep open our existing nuclear plants, but to figure out what we can do on nuclear licensing to make it more cost effective to build new nuclear plants, including advanced small modular reactors that are the next generation of nuclear facilities.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if you'll give me, I'm going to submit for the record some articles about technology of extraction of uranium from seawater, as well as an article from a Nobel Prize laureate physicist talking about the use of hyperpulse lasers to break down spent nuclear materials as making it inert, and the fact that we may be at the time where if we truly embrace technology, we may have the virtuous cycle upon us. And that I yield back.
Without objection, those will be added to the record. I appreciate my friend from the House bringing up the issue of SunZia. I would just point out, as someone who's been deeply involved in that project for most of that period, that it's actually the state-based Public Regulatory Commission and the former governor who objected to SunZia. They actually had a final environmental impact statement and a record of decision. So I don't think NEPA is to blame there. I think what we probably need is federal backstop authority for transmission planning, something which is included in the bipartisan infrastructure package and will facilitate much more transmission in this country. Mr. Baird, I want to ask you, your firm's doing this every day. Can you talk a little bit from that perspective? Have your clients seen health impacts, positive health impacts from these changes?
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator. We are working with MIT as well as Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health to measure air quality and asthma impact across the population in New York City, to measure the impacts on air quality and reductions in air pollution from electrifying buildings. And they are significant. They are so significant that the New York State government has opened an R&D exploration of the reduced impact on Medicaid and Medicare costs because of reduced emergency room visitation due to chronic asthma. The hospital systems in New York, they know which apartment buildings overproduce chronic asthmatics. They can give you a list of 600 or 700 apartment buildings in the Bronx which has the highest asthma rates in America, and they can say these are the apartment buildings in the Bronx that are overproducing asthma, even relative to other folks in the Bronx. And if we can green and electrify those buildings, we do dramatically reduce indoor air pollution caused by burning fossil fuels. There's 5,000 buildings in the Bronx that burn oil in their basements for heat and for hot water, which means it burns every single day, as whether it's summer or winter, there does need to be oil burned for hot water, for cooking and showering. And so we do believe that there are multiple academic, multi-year studies that will indicate that a reduction in air pollution will have a dramatically positive impact on asthma. This is going to end up being like lead, sir. Gas and oil in buildings, it's going to be like lead. We're going to look back on it 5 years from now and say, what were we thinking? How could we subject our children and the next generation to these toxins?
Would you characterize, I think one of the words I've heard is deindustrialization, characterize your buildings and what the residents of these buildings start with and what they end with, and would you characterize them as more or less advanced, technological, et cetera?
We characterize our buildings and our processes. We want to turn old, antiquated, fossil fuel wasting, unhealthy, systems in basements where no one wants to go and no one wants to breathe. We want to turn that building into a Tesla. Just like a Tesla is modern, it's all electric, it has the best software in the world. We can now do that to buildings. That's what a heat pump actually allows us to do, is to modernize buildings and bring them from the 1950s or 1960s into 2021 or even 2030. We are bringing low-income residents and school children who attend schools in the Bronx into the future by giving them the most modern technology that is available. And it is the opposite of deindustrialization. It is using all of the innovation and machine learning and hardware and software from Silicon Valley, which funds my company, and we are bringing that to bear in our neglected real estate sector across America to move them into the modern era and make people healthier and safer.
So let's get to the hard questions. Which ones of you actually own an induction stove? Because I think that's the elephant in the room. So for Dr. Stokes or Mr. Baird, I have to admit my own bias in thinking that, oh, how can I cook without gas, until I cooked with an induction stove. So tell me about that contrast, because everything else I think are things that people are going to naturally gravitate towards the obviously more efficient, more advanced heat pump solutions. But with natural gas, we did such a good job convincing ourselves that it was the right way to cook. Tell me about that.
Yeah, there's been a marketing campaign for a long time to sell gas to the American people. And, we believe cooking with gas, that it is the better way to cook. But what we're realizing is that we're not asking people to go back to those electric coils, which we can all agree are terrible. We are asking people to go to, as Danielle would put it, the Tesla of their stoves, right? Induction stoves are safer. They don't heat up. They basically use magnets to transfer to other surfaces the heat. And so they're safer. And of course, they're not emitting these toxins into homes, like the carcinogens that we've talked about, particulate matter, things that cause asthma. I honestly think the American people don't know, in some ways, all the risks of gas stoves in their homes and how much the technology has come ahead. And what we've got to do is make that technology the same cost as putting in a new gas stove, make it affordable, and that's where Congress can really help out with those zero emissions appliance rebates.
Thank you all. My time's expired, but I'm going to hopefully stick around for a second panel if I can. Congressman Estes, and then we'll have Congressman Peters after him.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, our economy had taken off, thanks in part to policies that valued America's energy independence. And today, as we try to recapture that economic boom that we saw before the pandemic, I worry that many companies who fought hard to stay afloat during COVID will ultimately fail with the rising tide of government mandates that make everything more expensive for them, including energy. And higher costs to power small businesses and homes will negatively affect both consumers as well as the family budget. the fact that nearly 80% of all U.S. energy comes from gas, oil, and coal, with wind and solar accounting for roughly 10%. So before we look at maybe what could be called unrealistic plans to remove fossil fuels completely from the U.S. economy, we should look at how do we focus on getting more efficient across the spectrum. And we certainly don't need special tax credits to subsidize electric vehicles for millionaires to arrive in California, particularly when my middle-class folks in Kansas have to pay for that write-off on the Tesla. So I'm a big advocate of an all-of-the-above energy strategy that prioritizes American energy independence, embraces the spectrum of fossil fuels and renewable energy, and doesn't necessarily focus on Washington picking winners and losers through these big subsidies. On the other side, looks a lot like an anything but strategy that demonizes fossil fuels and clean energy like nuclear. And everything but policy is bad for our economy and environment. We've seen that fracking and natural gas have reduced greenhouse gas emissions more than any other technology in the past 2 decades. And innovation in that sector were driven entirely by the private sector, not by some top-down government mandates. Dr. Dorado, research has shown that lower-income households spend more of their budget on energy bills. For example, a 2015 report found that households with less than $30,000 annually in income spend 23% of their after-tax income on energy, while households making over 50% annually spend just 7% of their after-tax income on energy. How do higher energy costs impact lower income families?
Thank you, Representative Estes. That is correct that poorer families spend a higher percentage of their budget on energy, and I think because energy is a necessity, and this is true across the board of almost all necessities, that they affect the poorest the most. I think it's extremely important that we focus on increasing productivity growth in our energy sector and use the opportunity afforded through conversations like this to drive progress in our energy system across the board, including next generation technologies like advanced nuclear and advanced geothermal. I think that productivity will disproportionately help the poorest Americans. Thank you.
Also, Dr. Dorado, you noted in your writing that the current structure of federal subsidies for clean energy generation particularly favors some forms of power over others. Senator Lee talked earlier about on federal lands, oil and gas being favored over geothermal. But isn't it also true that solar power is favored over geothermal? And how does that uneven nature of government subsidies affect clean energy production in the United States? And wouldn't a more neutral approach spur greater creation of what could ultimately be cheaper forms of energy for the future?
I think it would be an excellent idea to take a very close look at the permitting that we do on all forms of energy on federal land and see, what is the maximum scope for processes like categorical exclusions that would simplify permitting for solar and for geothermal and for anything else that we might want to do. So I think maximizing use of the both legislative or administrative categorical exclusions without regard to the energy source, I think would be very good for productivity.
Thank you. One of the things, and I'm about to run out of time, but one of the things that I noted is, as we've looked ahead at energy production, is that some of the renewables, actually the most likely ones that we talk about today in terms of wind and solar, are the least productive in terms of being efficient. And so we need to make sure that as we look to the future that we can have a total generating capacity that provide our electric needs going into the future. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Representative Peters.
Thank you, Senator Vice Chairman Heinrich, for holding this important hearing, also for mentioning the backstop authority for interstate high voltage transmission, which we worked on together, and I hope we can pass that out of the House next week. And it's great to be joined by climate advocates, electrification experts, and even a fellow San Diegan, and Mr. Matusiak. Good to see you on this side of the country. And before I start, I just want to say, too, to Mr. Schweikert, count me in on the people who want to deal with NEPA in the context of climate action. We have a very short time to get to where we need to, and I think we really have to look hard at the paperwork we put people through, particularly for things that are explicitly environmentally beneficial, and I would love to work with you on cutting down the time on that. Mr. Matusiak, I'm interested in the scale of this project. This is a tremendously ambitious idea. Can you tell me kind of what you mean by electrifying everything? And what does that mean in terms of time and cost and resources? And then I'm going to ask you kind of, if you were us, how would you set up a program that, in terms of funding and incentives, that would get us there?
Well, thank you, Congressman Peters. It's nice to see you here in Washington, and hopefully get to see you on the other side of the country, too.
The better side.
Which is where it's less humid and nicer weather. I would just say a couple of things. I think for us, the conversation about electrifying everything is just, it's a math question. How do we get to zero emissions, and how do we do that as quickly as possible? It's really electrifying almost everything. It's really focusing on our energy emissions, and our energy emissions in the country, our energy use in the country accounts for 90% of our emissions. So by transitioning and electrifying the economy, a few things happen. The first thing that happens is that we actually cut in half the amount of energy that we use as a country. Because the reality is that electric machines are much more efficient than non-electric ones. It turns out that the heat pumps that we're talking about today for people's homes are 3 times more efficient than the machines that they would replace. They are more efficient, and they cost less to operate than any other kind of machine on the market. So once we start electrifying the economy and our supply side, we have an opportunity to actually lower the amount of energy, reduce the amount of energy we use as a country, because it turns out that electrification is the efficiency. But where we focus, and what we have spent a lot of time thinking about, is the demand side of the question. Because when you electrify the supply side, when you decarbonize our supply, you still have machines on the other end that have to use the power that we are producing. And the opportunity that we have is to start thinking about American households as the keystone of our infrastructure. Because every single one of those households, as we go forward in the future, will have cars in the garage with batteries between the wheels, can have heat pumps in their homes that actually also serve as batteries, and each of those homes become a way for us to better balance the grid, to have better resilience, and to actually save Americans a lot of money so that they can plow it back into the economy.
Just to make sure we get to where I need to go is, I understand that from the perspective of new construction. That's relatively easy to understand. What would you do to accomplish the retrofit of existing buildings?
By our analysis, most American homes in the United States will save money on their bills if the front-end costs of these machines, these efficient electric heat pump machines, are the same as the ones that they would be replacing. And so really, Senator Heinrich has introduced a bill for rebates to lower the cost, the front-end cost of these machines, to make them the same as the ones that they would replace. We are convinced that Americans will choose those options if they are given the opportunity. And in addition to the rebates that we've talked about in terms of lowering the front-end costs, I would add 2 other things. The first is low-cost financing, because these machines last a very long time, 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25 years. We can amortize the costs over a long period of time to further reduce the monthly cost to the American homeowner. The second thing that I would add on top of the rebates goes to regulation. We can lower the cost to the American consumer by making it easier for these machines to be installed and ensuring that we have American workers who are trained to do that.
I'm going to run out of time. I guess the other thing I would just call for us to look at as we go forward is one of the issues with the deployment of solar, for instance, is that people who have the upfront money to put those in are somewhat advantaged, and it ends up with people who can't afford the upfront cost subsidizing the others. And I would like to make sure we come up with a way to ensure that that doesn't happen in this instance. And Mr. Chairman, the San Diegans had used up my 5 minutes.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to each of the witnesses. The advocates of the Green New Deal like to pitch their proposals in high-sounding rhetoric, but the reality of their proposals are that they would do four things. They would hurt the poor, they would hurt the working class, they would give special benefits and subsidies to the rich, and they would hurt the environment. The advocates of the Green New Deal like to pretend that they follow the science, that the laws of supply and demand somehow don't apply to them. And they pretend that by spending trillions of dollars, we're saving money. In a country that is blessed with vast natural resources, we should be paying a fraction of the price for electricity and gasoline. But because of bad policies at the local, state, and federal level, Californians pay on average twice as much per kilowatt for electricity and $1 more per gallon of gas as people in Texas and most of the country. And if you want to understand the Green New Deal, it is to bring the failed energy policies of California to force them on the rest of the country. And for anyone who might pause to say, well, what's so wrong with that? You can look no further than a census report released this month, September of 2021, that concluded out of 50 states, which state has the highest level of poverty? The answer is, of course, the state of California, as it was the year before, as it was the year before, as it was the year before. California, according to the Census Bureau's latest calculation, 15.4% of California residents lived in poverty from 2018 to 2020. There's only one place in the United States that exceeds the poverty level for California, and that is the place we find ourselves right now, the District of Columbia. D.C. has the highest poverty level. California has the second. Now, what do those two jurisdictions share in common? They are governed exclusively by Democrats. They are governed by policies that drive up the costs of working class people, of low income people, and at the same time give generous subsidies to millionaires. So the proposals we have before us are to force Americans to shift from their gas furnace to a heat pump. They are to force Americans to shift from their car or truck in their driveway to a much higher priced electric vehicle, to give them no choice in the matter, but not only that, in doing so, to hurt the environment. Right now, a significant percentage of electricity is produced by coal-fired plants. As a very practical step, if you are shifting from a gas to an electric vehicle in a jurisdiction where your electricity is coming from coal, you are moving to a dirtier and more environmentally damaging way of travel. It's also worth noting that of every country on earth, there's one country that has reduced CO2 more than any other country, and that is the country we are in right now, the United States of America. The United States of America has reduced CO2 emissions steadily. They peaked in 2007, and they have been steadily declining ever since. Right now, today, we emit the same amount of CO2 as we did in the early 1990s, and even less methane, despite having a population of 60 million more. Now, why is that? The principal driver of our steady reduction in CO2 is the substitution of natural gas for coal production and electricity. If the advocates of the Green New Deal actually believed their rhetoric that reducing CO2 was a good thing, they wouldn't fight tooth and nail to kill natural gas production, to kill natural gas pipelines, to shut it down. Mr. Matusiak, your biography says that you are a managing partner of an advisory firm focused on addressing climate change and economic inequality. Suppose that the electrification policy you've testified about today were to be implemented fully and entirely. What would be the temperature effect by the year 2100 using the EPA's own climate model?
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I haven't done that calculation on the back of this testimony, but what I would say is that if we were going to fully implement the climate policy we're talking about today, we would be ensuring on a voluntary basis that homeowners all across the country, households all across the country, would be able to elect to purchase a heat pump water heater, a space heater, induction stove.
So, sir, if you haven't done the research on what the climate benefit would be from the policies you're advocating using the EPA's own model, I'll tell you what they would be. According to the EPA's own model, in 2100, so 80 years from now, global temperature would be lowered by 0.173 degrees Celsius. And in exchange for that, you would impose trillions of dollars of costs on African Americans, on Hispanics, on low-income Americans, and you would drive up poverty across the country. It's difficult to ascertain why that's good for this country.
So I would just respond by saying a couple of things. The first is that 40% of our emissions are come from decisions made around the kitchen table in households all across America. The effect of the policy that we're talking about here today is to drive 40% of those emissions down to zero. The component piece of that with respect to America's contribution to global emissions would be the 40% of America's contribution to global emissions.
Do you dispute the APA number?
The gentleman's time has expired.
The effect on American households would be to put money back into the pockets of American families. Because the reality is that people are paying way too much on their energy bills. And those energy bills, as was stated earlier by one of your colleagues, are inelastic. People have to pay.
Thank you for your patience, Mr. Matusiak. Congressman Trone has been.
Don't want him to answer that one?
I would be happy to let him answer that one. If
Good.
everyone else
I would welcome. Do you dispute the EPA number?
I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
Do you dispute the EPA number that the effect of all these proposals by the year 2100 would be to decrease global temperature by 0.173 degrees Celsius?
What I know is what we are stacking in terms of emissions as a country. And what I know is what our North Star needs to be. And our North Star needs to be to get to zero.
Okay, I take
and the only way to get to zero is to electrify as many of the things as we can in this economy. Thank you.
Congressman Trone, thanks for your patience.
Mr. Chairman, would it be okay if I asked a few questions rather than give a partisan speech?
It would.
That'd be great. Let's do it then. Mr. Baird, in your testimony, you discussed some of the incredible work that Block Power LLC has been doing in solar and energy efficient technology, and you also highlighted how your company employs people in vulnerable populations. One of my top priorities in Congress is criminal justice reform. I'm very passionate about connecting justice-impacted individuals with the resources to build back a better life. How do you think a transition to the greener energy technology will impact the job market for disadvantaged folks like our justice-impacted individuals?
Thank you, sir, for the question. I sit on the board of the New York Federal Reserve Bank back in New York, and one of the things we look at is construction data. And across the country, our ability to build new buildings, retrofit existing buildings, and do construction across America is impacted by the fact that folks from our generation, me and Dr. Stokes, we don't necessarily want to go work for our baby boomer parents' plumbing company, it turns out. We want to be on YouTube as an influencer. And so there is a shortage of highly skilled construction workers across America that is impacting our economic productivity. We think there's a massive opportunity here in front of all of us to train and to employ into economically and environmentally productive work, jobs, returning citizens, to install heat pumps, to assess buildings in need of furnace upgrades or replacements, to keep our kids healthy at home and in school. And in New York City, we were actually partnering with the city government. Right now, we're hiring 1,500 young adults who are at risk of gun violence, as defined by the district attorney in all 5 boroughs. These folks have witnessed gun violence. They've been impacted by gun violence in high-crime, low-income neighborhoods in New York City. And so we're hiring hundreds and hundreds of these young people. We're training them in cutting-edge software out of Silicon Valley. How do you build a 3D model of a building with a three-dimensional camera on top of your construction hat, so that not only can they participate in the current construction economy, but they can participate in innovating and leading and ensuring that American construction workers are at the forefront of innovation?
I think that's fantastic, Mr. Baird, and my company's hired over 500 returning citizens, and it's good when you can do good business and do right by other folks, too.
They work harder, in fact, sir, as I'm sure you know, because when you find the right folks, they are indeed very focused and ready to work in a way that other folks may not be.
And we have a better retention rate.
Correct.
Mr. Matusiak, if we could jump over, this administration has put back the Build Back Better plan to invest in the American people and our economy. It's vital this plan works to ensure individuals have access to technology that's safe for them and the planet. The President's plan is an opportunity to lay out the groundwork for long-term change. How can we ensure these investments through Build Back Better can be targeted to help address disparities we have in electrification?
Thank you, Congressman. Wonderful question. And the reality is we have to be aware of the price disparities that face American households when it comes to not just the energy burden of their current bills, but also what it's going to mean for them to electrify. One of the things Senator Heinrich has done through his legislation is introduce a bill that would recognize those disparities by putting increased dollars in the form of consumer point-of-sale rebates to low and moderate income households as compared to those who are not. Those are the kinds of approaches we need to take. We need to be eyes open to the costs associated with the transition, enabling low and moderate income families who frankly have the most to gain from the transition by electrifying their homes, enabling them to participate in that transition, and making sure as a matter of public policy that we are putting the thumb on the scale and investing in enabling them to do so.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Representative Arrington.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you, panelists. I'm from Texas. I share some of my colleagues' sentiments, if not all of them, and I understand that there are good intentioned folk on both sides of this issue with respect to the electrification of our country and our power systems, and I don't judge or impugn the motives of those who want to do it. I think it's all in the way we approach it. And I think the way my colleagues are approaching it on the Democrat side is just too extreme, it's too radical, it's too abrupt, it's going to be too costly, it's not balanced with respect to what we need to continue to grow our economy, not just for the opportunities and the prosperity for America, but vis-a-vis our adversaries and our competitors. We need to look at questions fundamentally that I think are inconclusive, like the human activity, industrial activities contribution to overall relative to the ebb and flow of our carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. I think we need to make decisions also with respect to the United States contribution. Again, relative to the rest of the world, including China and other much larger polluters and much bigger problems. So I'm just very concerned about what I think is ideologically driven. I really do. Like I said, I think a lot of this is inconclusive. We have been blessed with fossil fuels. And there's not hardly a thing in this room, and including the microphone, our smartphones, the glasses that Mr. Dorado's wearing, our clothes, medicines, medical devices that don't have hydrocarbon component parts. Actually, 90% of the products that we use have some
petrochemical element to them. And the natural gas shale revolution has been a gift to the United States. And again, not just our quality of lives, but for consumers to have affordable ways to heat and cool their home and get to and from work, to give us a competitive advantage to China, who does not share our values, and to give us energy independence. It's been remarkable. And I'm concerned, Mr. Chairman, about the hostility. And I hear it from my Ways and Means colleagues, with all due respect to Mr. Beyer. He made mention at a hearing that we were going to burn up the planet. I don't think that's right. I think we need to manage emissions. We need to steward our environment. But we got to be smart about this. I don't have a prepared speech here, and I'm not going to try to rail on anybody in particular. I just think it's a fool's errand to try to radically transform the greatest economy in the world and have this in a way that picks winners and losers. I mean, if you're going to accelerate technology like battery storage and the production, sustainability, reliability of renewables, at least let the market drive it, and let's have technology-neutral government intervention so that we can make sure the right technologies are being brought to bear to get us where we're going. I think we're way too focused on the clean and the reduction, and it's very de minimis in terms of our global contribution. You could take away all of transportation, and it's going to be really a 1%, 2% reduction globally. Why not be rational and smart in the heat of emotional debates on both sides, have an all-the-above approach? My district generates more wind energy than any district in the country, 3 times California. But I'm also on top of the largest oil basin in the world. And we coexist peacefully, and we're transitioning, I think, responsibly. So I should have a question here, I know, but I'm very concerned about the path we're on. I think it's extremely irresponsible. I think there's a lot of radical climate alarmist and ideologues driving this, and I think it's going to ruin the greatest economy in the world. And China's going to pounce on us, and they're just waiting for us to trip up. But as they say, I've seen the enemy, and the enemy's us. Let's work together on all the above in a smart and logical and responsible transition. That would be my plea to my colleagues. And I'm sorry I went over time. I had some questions, but I will yield back because I've expired. At least my time has.
Representative Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to my colleagues and to all of our witnesses. Clearly, we have different opinions that you've heard today. I guess that could be the beauty of having testimony, winners and losers, radical. Sorry, my colleague from Texas left because, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to remind him about talking about those failures of energy policies in other states. I think it was only earlier this year that his home state of Texas had a colossal failure of its electric grid. And it led to blackouts and price gouging for electricity costs. And this happened because they refused to make the investments necessary to harden their grill, as while my colleagues, Democrats, are trying to build back better in the budget reconciliation. But he might not have remembered that because I think maybe he was on vacation somewhere. But with that, to the witnesses, Mr. Baird, as chair of the House Financial Services Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee, I have routinely sought ways for more venture capital investments to find its way to minority and women-owned companies. According to the business database Crunchbase, women-led startups receive roughly 2.3% of venture capital investments in 2020, and another study found that Black-owned startups only received around 2.9% of venture capitals in 2019. Can you tell me, as an African-American male who founded a very successful startup and secured venture capital investments from one of the largest venture capital firms in the country, Can you discuss your experience in securing venture capital investment or any thoughts that you may have on how to increase the minority-owned startups receiving venture capital?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. Thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and for your leadership on financial services. When starting our company, we met with 200 venture capitalists back to back to back. Everyone told us no for a variety of reasons. The real reason was they weren't quite comfortable with the risk that our company and perhaps my profile as a founder signified. Early stage venture capital investing is like dating, it turns out. There actually are nonverbal communications, and were you part of this fraternity or sorority? And these things really matter at the stage of investment before a company has proven itself in the marketplace, before it has customers, before it has revenue, before it has traction. And early stage investors taking a bet on the founder, and you too often find, according to the statistics that you outline, that since most venture capitalists are men, they too often are not comfortable investing in women and will say things like, oh, well, that's interesting. Let me ask my wife if this is a good company for me to invest in. So that is a problem. For me, we were very fortunate to win a clean energy contract for $2.5 million from the U.S. Department of Energy. It was competitively bid. We bid and competed against some of the largest engineering firms in America. But the Department of Energy at that time was responsive to innovation and to technology and software and worked with us collaboratively, in fact, bent over backwards to, once we won the contract, to help us access the capital, the legal services, the accounting services that we needed to further qualify to actually begin the contract. I think there's a major opportunity when we look at HUD. You don't see that kind of small business innovation budget at HUD in the same way as you do at the Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Energy. And so I think it is important to look into what are the ways that we can fund innovation out of HUD. We hosted the EPA Administrator Michael Regan in the Bronx to visit one of our schools that we've electrified on Monday. And he suggested an interagency working group with himself, the Secretary of Energy, and Secretary Fudge at HUD to begin to look at how BIPOC climate tech startups could work together to partner with the federal government to deliver the climate tech solutions that our communities need, particularly with respect to the infrastructure spending that's coming down. How do we prepare communities that have been historically disenfranchised to access the capital that they are entitled to?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Klobuchar.
Well, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair, as well as Senator Lee for this hearing. I'm going to start with the exciting world of appliances, or as I call it, building a fridge to the next century. Okay, okay, so one example of this is that we have a co-op. We have a lot of electric co-ops in our state, the highest number per capita of any state. Interesting, electric co-ops. And it's a different scale of development, of course, of energy innovation. But one called the Steel West Sika Co-op developed a program where customers who purchased a solar panel would receive a free water heater with a demand control switch. And they showed me all these people purchased solar panels, not for their farms, actually. They were right outside of the co-op. But then they got this water heater. Mr. Matusiak, Dr. Stokes, can you comment on ways to speed up the deployment of cleaner appliances, not just water heaters, anything? Senator Hoeven and I actually ended up doing a bill on this, but that's another story, so go ahead.
Well, Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for the question. It's an honor to have the conversation with you. If you ever look at your water heater in your house, you might see that yellow sticker that tells you how much the yearly energy costs are. And just to give you a window into maybe that sticker and what it could say, a conventional gas water heater has a yearly energy cost of $293, high efficiency gas, $271, a modern heat pump electric water heater, $104. There's a reason why the co-op in your state is giving heat pump water heaters out with the solar panels. It is because once you start electrifying one thing in the house, it becomes easier to electrify other things in the house, and the savings stack on top of one another. And so for us, what is really critical is that we get started. Every single day in Minnesota and across the country, water heaters are failing, furnaces are failing, people are changing out stovetops. Appliances have useful lives, then they come up and they need to be swapped out. And homeowners are not actually experts when it comes to water heaters and furnaces. I have yet to meet a single American or anybody that I've talked to who has said, I can't wait for that new model water heater to come out next year because I'm absolutely upgrading. That's not how it works. And so therefore, what needs to happen is that the front end cost of these machines need to be at the same level as the ones that they would otherwise have a choice to buy. If they are, the savings will be apparent, the benefits will be apparent, and our firm belief is that American families will vote with their wallets and bring the climate benefits along with them.
Okay. You want to just quick add anything to that, Dr. Stokes?
Sure. I'd just like to elevate the work of Vice Chairman Heinrich with his Zero Emissions Home Act, which may be slightly renamed, that is working on rebates for Americans so that it is more affordable to get these appliances.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what we really need in the Build Back Better plan.
Okay, very good. Mr. Baird, one of the things we also have found challenging is nonprofits and making sure that a lot of them are in older buildings and then they've got limited resources that they want to give for whatever their work is, or the churches or the synagogues, mosques. And another bill we did actually did something with that to make it easier for nonprofits, and it was included. It's in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Talk about how we can make that easier and why that's a good idea. And then I have one last quick question for you, Dr. Dorado. So if you could keep it to 30 seconds, Mr. Baird.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I'll give you an example of a church in Westchester, New York. We reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by 70%, 7-0, which was great for all the millennials and Gen Zers to encourage them to attend services because their church was addressing the climate crisis, which is important to our generation. But we also saved them $25,000 a year, which they were able to reinvest in raises for Sunday school teachers and other items. Using the rebates that Dr. Stokes spoke about are very important to helping all Americans access the benefits of clean energy technology.
Okay, you did it in 30 seconds. That was impressive. Mr. Dorado, you talked about in your testimony, diversified carbon-free energy sources, streamlining permitting. We've got about $75 million in the bipartisan infrastructure bill for states to establish their own permitting programs and giving federal agencies the direction to evaluate and look at permitting timelines. I'm especially obsessed with this with the pandemic and how things got disrupted and then trying to get things done and approved. I think, if anything, it's gotten worse. Can you, over the last 2 years, can you speak to the importance of streamlining and investing in efficient permitting?
Yes, Senator. I think it's critical, and I think, in particular, it creates a lot of value. Even if we are going to do subsidies, I think combining it, subsidies with streamlined permitting returns higher value to the taxpayer, because you're not just subsidizing people to go through this painful permitting process that often has not very much point.
Okay.
So I think it adds a lot of value.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair and Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Senator. There's interest in folks in doing a second round. If it's okay with everyone, I'd like to suggest that the second round be limited to 3 minutes, and I'll stick around as long as I possibly can. Chairman Baird.
Thank you, Senator, very much. With respect to my friend from Texas, who is really my friend, I just want to quote from the August 9th IPCC at the UN that quoted 14,000 different studies that said the changes in climate today have little parallel in human history. The last decade is quite likely the hottest the planet's been in 125,000 years. The world's glaciers are melting and receding at a rate unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. Atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide have not been this high in at least 2 million years. Ocean levels have risen 8 inches on average over the past century, and the rate of increase has doubled since 2006. Heat waves have become significantly hotter since 1950 and last longer in much of the world. Bursts of extreme heat in the ocean, which can kill fish, seabirds, and coral reefs, have doubled in frequency since the 1980s. And I believe we have just come through the hottest summer on record. I'm going to stick with the burning up the planet. By the way, I wish that were not true. I mean, nothing would thrill me more than science to come through and say that we've misunderstood climate change. But for the moment, I think I'm going to stick with the 14,000 studies. Mr. Baird, tell us about the business model. Can you really make a profit and have homes save energy and save costs? And what's their payback? How many years?
Thank you for the question, sir. We have a credit line with Goldman Sachs for $50 million. We did 36 months of extensive financial due diligence with the team at Goldman Sachs in order to answer your question. The Goldman folks, they are interested in environmental sustainability, but they are more interested in profit. And they invested this capital with our company because we were able to demonstrate that on a unit economics basis per building, we were able to generate significant savings. A 70% reduction in energy usage dramatically lowers energy costs so significantly that you can use those savings as part of your financial underwriting. So if you're spending $50,000 per year on energy right now, and that baseline cost comes down to $25,000, you now have $25,000 of savings, which you can use as part of your financial payback. For large heat pump projects in New York City, we see paybacks within 7 to 15 years. And we think that a financial product, we in Goldman believe that you can kind of almost create like a green mortgage where a rebate from the utility company or from the federal government would be used almost kind of like a credit enhancement or an FDIC guarantee at the end of that 15-year term.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Baird, very much.
Representative Arrington.
Thank you. I'm looking at Steve Koonen's book. He was an Obama administration senior official at Department of Energy. He says hurricanes and tornadoes are becoming more fierce. Climate change will be an economic disaster, surging sea levels. He said, you've heard all this presented as fact, but according to science, all these statements are profoundly misleading. And he goes on to say that these are not definitive. They're unsettled. That's the name of his book. So I get it. It's sincere. I'm not going to question, again, your motive. I think the reality is when you look at, for example, just the combustion engine and just transportation, our transportation systems, driven by hydrocarbon fuels, contributes 4% globally to the greenhouse gas emissions. If you put everybody in an electric vehicle, probably not going to be able to accomplish this goal on planes and trains all the way, but you just do the electric vehicles. And you have your charging stations, you got to get electricity somewhere. By the time you get to netting out the emissions from charging the cars, it's 1%. It's less than 1%. And we're going to try to subsidize and the entire electric vehicle industry and put everybody in an electric car. The math doesn't work. To your point, it's a math problem at that point. I mean, we could do it, but we're $28 trillion in debt. We're not paying any of this. And look, I'm going to say the Republicans are just as guilty in not paying for stuff. That's the biggest threat to our country, not climate change. I'd say obesity is a bigger threat to our country. And the disease states that follow, I'd say opioid epidemic's a bigger threat. It's more immediate. I'd say inflation's a bigger concern to most Americans. But I'll get to a question because I think you get the point about where I sit and stand on this issue. And I'd like to be objective about it, but on this whole electrification and the data that I went through on how much we would actually reduce our carbon footprint relative to the global pollution, Mr. Dorado, what's the smartest way to get us to the goal of a reduction in carbon emission, if that's your thing? And maybe it's wise to manage that down, as we already are, and lead the world. How do we accelerate that so that we're not subsidizing things that don't get us there most efficiently and effectively for the goal, for the taxpayer, for the economy, and for all the other things, quite frankly, that don't get much consideration? Clean gets all the love, but reliability and affordability ought to be in the mix, don't you think? And can you answer that question? Pretty broad.
I do think
And thank
so.
you again, Mr. Chairman, for the additional questions. And Mr. Byer is my friend, and I respect his position.
And next time, I'll bring a bag of question marks for all of our folks, too. Go ahead.
Yes, Congressman, as I testified, I believe the way to do it is through technology, which I am gratified that we are talking about technology today. I think it's a wide range of technologies, including next generation nuclear and geothermal. I think to really advance the whole suite of technologies that we'll need to reduce our carbon emissions, we need to take a very close look at permitting and make it easier to build in this country, build all kinds of new infrastructure across the board. So I think, and use sort of technology neutral policies to get us there.
Thank you. I think I want to talk a little bit about math, because comparing us to the rest of the world in our emissions does miss the point that we are I believe, the second biggest emitter in the world today after China, but we're also the largest historical emitter. So we put a lot of this stuff in the atmosphere in the first place and got us to where we are today in terms of parts per million in that atmosphere. Now, my friend from Texas, not Congressman Arrington, but the other friend from Texas who was here for a little while, said that if you plug an electric vehicle into a coal-fired power plant, it's dirtier than a gas vehicle. That math doesn't work, and it doesn't work because an internal combustion engine is only about 30 to 35% efficient, whereas an electric motor is well over 90% efficient in most applications. So even if you plug into a power plant, that's not true. But if you plug in Texas, where so much of their power comes from wind, it gets even cleaner. So I do think that the math here matters, and one of the most fascinating things that I learned from the work that Rewiring has done and the work that Saul Griffith has done on primary energy is the realization that if we electrify, we can actually cut our primary energy in half. Mr. Matusiak, can you elaborate on that and explain why that is?
Yes, thank you, Senator Heinrich. I think the shorthand is electrification is the efficiency, because as you just said, electric motors are 3 times more efficient than fossil fuel ones. Just for clarification, cars represent 15% of U.S. emissions, 12% of our energy emissions. But the important point is that every single one of the machines that we're talking about is an appreciating climate asset, because you're talking about the demand side, where people are buying things, holding onto them for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, while the grid is getting cleaner and cheaper. And so when it comes to, Senator, your question about why electrification enables us to save so much energy in the end, it is because of the technology embedded in these machines and what they enable us to do. One other additional point that I would just make, which is important, is that every single one, most of these machines, we're talking about the heat pumps and the cars, are also part of the grid. They go to the resilience of our whole grid because we are starting to put aspects of the grid, storage, in garages and in basements across 121 million households in the U.S. That helps us manage load over the day. It helps us respond if there is ever a failure like there was in Texas or like there was after Hurricane Ida. And it enables us to ensure that we have households who can maintain power and work and persist with their day-to-day activities when there is a grid failure. You can't do that if you have a battery in your garage and a gas-fired furnace in your basement. The two things need to talk to each other.
But if you have an electric F-150 and the lights go out, you can run your skill saw and you can even plug in your house. And that's what today was all about. I want to thank Chairman Beyer for scheduling this hearing and for participating. I want to thank all of our members who came and participated today, and I want to thank our witnesses. The record is going to stay open for 3 business days, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.